We have been discussing the question of aviation in Africa. We think the level of us traveling by air is so thin that it is not helping. We have reduced. In the past, we used to go to big capitals by going via Europe all the time. We have reduced. We need also to put the aviation in the basket because it is part of what Africa should do so that it is easy for the investors to come in.
Now, if African economies are to reap the benefit of investment, traveling across the continent must be made easier. In reality, though, it is still cheaper to travel from an African capital to Europe than it is to cross our very own borders. But statistics show that better air travel on the continent could increase the continent's GDP by more than $1 billion. So what is holding back intra-African travel, and how can we liberalize Africa's skies? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, while many air markets between Africa and countries outside of the continent have been liberalized to a significant extent, most intra-African aviation options remain largely closed. A recent report by the International Air Transport Association analyzed air services across 12 key African cities based on 2013 figures. As you can see mapped here across the 12 countries, there are 66 pairings of routes, but only 34 of them have some sort of direct services covering them, and that's just over half. Across the continent, there was an average of 134 daily flights between 94 pairs of cities. Now, these are just numbers, but using modern technology, we can now give you more of a visual reference to put into perspective, courtesy of flightradar24.com. This is a map of the total active flights in the world at 1200 GMT on the 16th of June. As you can see, Europe and large parts of Asia have aircraft literally covering their continents. Africa, down below, is a completely different story. Add to this that in 2012, the total number of passengers traveling by air in the European Union could be established at just over 841 million. In Africa, that number was just 63 million. But what if these skies were liberalized? According to the IATA reports, liberalization between the 12 countries studied could generate an estimated 155,100 jobs in aviation, tourism, and the wider economy, and could contribute $1.3 billion to annual GDP. Well, to give us a better understanding of why African skies are lagging behind, specifically in costing, CCTV's UK correspondent Richard Bestick is standing by in London. Well, Richard, is it really that much cheaper to travel to Europe from Africa?
Well, yes, Beatrice, it turns out it is cheaper to fly from London here to cities in Africa, which is strange, really, because we use pretty much the same planes in Europe, with aviation fuel priced at about the same cost. To discover the reason for these perplexing differences, I'm here at the African Tourism and Travel Association, asking why.
Because there's very, very big competition. The competition has been driven by producing tourism and by producing business traffic, and therefore most of the main carriers are flying to the flying to the hubs in Africa. So that drives prices down. If you've got competition, it drives prices down. What has happened in the domestic market, which you refer to, so why are prices more expensive in the domestic market? The reason is that there has never been much competition. It all depends on the government's policy for open skies. If a government wants to have competition, then that's going to keep prices down. But governments are fearfully protective about their brand. They're very, very protective about it, and they don't really like competition coming in. So, for instance, in the south, in southern Africa, South African Airways rule the roost. They can charge pretty well what they like. Now, what we want to see is airlines coming in and breaking that rule.
The future looks bright. Prices inside Africa could be coming down at some stage in the future, even though now they're high.
Now, prices have got to come down because Africa is changing. You know, the huge change in Africa will be the rise of domestic tourism. So, or even domestic business. There's a new African middle class coming up who are affluent, who are doing a lot of business, and they need to get about. So in the past that never happened. In the past, all the traffic was from Europe to Africa. This is all going to change. It's all going to be about domestic tourism. So that's why prices have got to be driven down.
Which possibly explains it. But there is one more difference that makes the pricing policy, if anything, yet more unfair. It's the difference in time it takes a UK worker to earn the money to buy a plane ticket compared to those in African cities. In South Africa, working without a break, it could take a domestic worker on the legal minimum wage very nearly 5 months to save up the cash. While here in the UK, it'll take somebody on the minimum wage just 13 days to earn the money for a ticket. Richard Bestick, CCTV, London.
Thank you, Richard. Well, we're going to take a short break now, but when we return, we'll continue with our discussion on liberalizing the African skies. Stay with us.
The theme everybody says is tremendous opportunity in Africa. We want to do more, but make it easier to get to Africa, whether it's visas or flights. Now, tomorrow afternoon, I have a luncheon appointment in Lagos. And the way I'm getting there this evening is via Dubai. I think we can do better. There's a huge opportunity. I don't see this as a glass half empty. I see this as a glass half full. There's a huge opportunity.
Well, that was Standard Chartered's Group Executive Director V. Shankar at the recent World Economic Forum on Africa, speaking about the challenges facing intra-African travel. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, we're going to broaden this discussion somewhat. China's Southern Airlines recently announced plans for a non-stop flight between Guangzhou and Nairobi. The airline was in Nairobi to launch this, where CCTV managed to speak to Welt Chung, the Senior Vice President of the airline, about why they have chosen Africa and the challenges involved. Let's listen in.
The most challenging will be the OD market numbers. For example, is the number on a certain origin to destination. We found that the African market is very diversified. It's not like European or North America. For example, from Guangzhou to Los Angeles, we have enough passenger to fulfill the cabin, the airplane. But to Africa, we need to have a connection. We cannot only rely on the online cities. For example, we are going to launch Guangzhou to Nairobi, but the passenger base of Nairobi cannot afford to feed the whole airplane. We need to have connection beyond Nairobi to other cities in Africa. We are encouraged by Chinese government's Belt and Road initiative. We are confident that the Belt and Road initiative will greatly enhance the trade and cultural link between China and Africa. So we see the market potential there. But by operating service regularly as a scheduled service is another story, because on the one hand, we need the support from the Chinese government so we can offer more service to Africa. On the other hand, we also expect that the Kenya governments can provide all support which is necessary for operating a scheduled service. For example, the traffic light, the schedule, time, the slot in Nairobi airport, something like that. But so far, I think the KCAA, the Kenya Civil Aviation Authority, and the Kenya Airport Authority, they are very helpful to China Southern.
And now to help chart the way towards more liberal skies in Africa, I'm joined in studio in Nairobi by Raphael Kuchi. He's the Vice President for Africa at the International Air Transport Association. And standing by for us in Johannesburg is Monique Schwartz. She's the founder of the African Business Travel Association. Also joining us from Cairo is Yahya El Dikan. He's the CEO of Holiday Tours. To you all, thank you very much for being on Talk Africa. Raphael Kuchi, let me start off with you there, though. All we're hearing is it is difficult to get to Africa from the outside. It is difficult to get into Africa, connecting across the continent, whether it is visas or whether it is more flights, as Mr. Shankar said there in that bite earlier. Why is this?
Well, Africa has been a very difficult market over a very long time, and the reasons are not far-fetched. Across the African region, many of the airlines that are started are grossly underfunded, and because of that, their network is very limited, and they are unable to carry much traffic. As you heard from the Executive Director of China Southern, the O&D traffic, origin to destination traffic, is very limited in Africa, and therefore operators need to be network carriers in order to mop up traffic into their hubs so that they can be able to operate at higher load factors. But this is not the case. Now, the other thing is that the cost of operating in Africa is extremely high compared to other regions. To that extent, many of the African airlines, because they don't have much traffic and the volume of passengers are low, they are unable to have higher load factors. All
right, but that's the whole question, though. I mean, the cost of operating is high and passenger numbers are low, but the cost of travel itself is still prohibitive for many Africans. How can this be solved, though, to increase the numbers?
The cost of operation in Africa is actually a function of the cost of the services that are being provided by various service providers to airlines. If you take fuel, for instance, today fuel prices are coming down in many parts of the world. But in Africa, the fuel price on average is still between 40 to 45% higher than the global average. So for operators operating within Africa, it makes it very difficult for them to operate profitably.
All right. Monique, to you, though, you're in the business travel industry. Just give us an insight of your challenges as a business travel consultant on the continent.
Certainly. Well, I think one of the key things that we have seen in the last few years is that speaking to travel buyers, so you're talking about procurement managers and people responsible for sending business travelers across the continent, they're telling us that they just can't be doing as much as they would like to be doing. They have various different goals and objectives for opening up branches and doing new sales relationships and channels across Africa, and they just are not able, because often of the costs and often because of the limited routings, they're not able to do as much as they would like to do across the continent, which is quite a sad fact, that if we were able to open the skies and make travel more affordable to people, we'd be seeing a lot more business happening internally on the African continent.
All right. Here to you, though, in Cairo, if you can hear me there, in Cairo, you're in the tourism sector, though, of course, tourism is a major component of African economies, many African economies. What are your challenges? What's your view?
Well, mainly, when we sell travel packages to the world regarding Africa, we always get requests similar to combining countries as Egypt and Jordan, and Egypt and Turkey, maybe Egypt and Palestine. And while it should always be Egypt and Kenya and Egypt and South Africa, because sometimes clients will come from very far distance, like Japan or Australia or Latin America or the Americas in general, they would like to combine different countries together while on passing those long distance flights. So, and it's really expensive to take a client on a trip in both the desert safari in Egypt and maybe a jungle safari in Kenya and a game safari in Kenya because of the flights.
All right, Mr. Kuchi, though, you're hearing all these complaints, the big issue here being the cost is prohibitive. How can this come down?
Well, for cost to come down, we need to tackle the cost related to service providers at the airport. We also need to encourage our governments in Africa to reduce taxes and charges. In many of the African countries, taxes imposed on air travel ranges between $20 per ticket to about $120 per ticket. Now, it is no surprising that low-cost carriers are finding it difficult to penetrate the African market because the cost is prohibitive and they cannot actually sustain their business model on the continent. The other area is, as I mentioned earlier, the fuel cost. We need to bring down the fuel cost. We need to improve our ground handling because in most cases, most of the airports, the ground handling service providers as well as the fuel providers are monopolies. And we all know what the impact of monopolies are anywhere in the world. They're very inefficient and yet they charge prohibitively because you have no alternative. So we need to address the cost element. The second issue is we need to improve connectivity across Africa. With improved connectivity, we're going to help the airlines to be able to mobilize traffic from different points in Africa. As the O&D traffic is limited, we have to bring the connectivity, connecting passengers into hubs, similar to what Kenya Airways and Ethiopian Airlines are doing today.
All right, I'll come back to that question of that whole issue of connectivity in just a moment. But Monique, I want to get your input here, particularly the whole question of visa restrictions as was set out earlier on in this program.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's one of the biggest known facts about Africa is that the amount of restrictions and the costs and the inefficiencies and the amount of red tape to be able to travel between countries is just really, really excessive. There's certain countries that have absolutely no bilateral agreements with other countries. Absolutely every single nationality coming into the country needs to have a visa. I think my biggest issue really is that governments need to look a bit closer at what they're doing. There's so much insular thought behind looking at how they deal with travel. Travel is seen often as a luxury, and so it is taxed as a luxury. It's seen as something that, like other luxuries, is not maybe a necessary part of life. But in order for our continent to expand and to grow and to reach its full potential, business travel specifically, and tourism obviously, is a vital, vital element of that. And for governments to be looking at business travel as something that can be taxed as heavily as it is, I think is really just something that needs to be addressed.
All right.
As a matter of urgency.
Mr. Kuchi, I'll just come back to you on that whole question. Is it possible, though, to expand direct flights, intra-Africa flights, though?
Yes, it is very possible to expand intra-Africa flights. But before we do that, there is an intra-Africa air transport liberalization program that was adopted by the OAU in those days, and which to date has not been fully implemented. This program is called the Yamoussoukro Decision, and this program was intended to make Africa a single air transport market. In other words, it was going to facilitate airlines, irrespective of where they are established in Africa, to be able to fly to any other part of Africa any number of times, any times of the day, without restrictions. Unfortunately, the failure to implement the Yamoussoukro Decision has led to many of the airlines operating in the on the continent subjected to what we call bilateral air services agreements, where the number of frequencies between two countries is actually limited. Now, once you exhaust that and the number of frequencies you have, irrespective of whether the traffic exists or not, you cannot grow further. And this is actually an impediment to connectivity on the continent.
All right, but Mr. Kuchi, though, of the 44 countries that had signed up for the Yamoussoukro declaration, there are only about 11 have so far put their names down for that declaration. What is it that is standing in the way of full implementation of the Yamoussoukro declaration and the full implementation of liberalization policies, though, across the continent?
Well, first of all, is the fear of the unknown. As you know, in many of the African countries, we have national carriers. And the thinking has always been that because these national carriers are weak, if you open up your market, other stronger carriers will come in and take over the market, and your national carrier will die. So in the interest of protecting the national carrier, some countries have decided we are not going to open up. The second reason is just because many of these African countries have the intention of one day establishing their own national carriers. And because they have these plans, they do not also want to open up because you don't want the traffic to be taken away by other operators before your own national carrier stands. All
right. Monique, though, at the moment, where do you see the frequency of flights? What are your easier destinations? Or what are your most difficult destinations to get to across the continent?
I think certainly some of the key emerging markets are the ones that are having the most focus for a lot of the carriers. Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Angola to a certain extent are kind of the countries that we focus on as far as the emerging markets. Obviously South Africa I think has the majority of routes and capacity. But I think certainly where the challenge comes in is that a lot of the members of our association that we deal with, a lot of what they do is fairly remote. They don't necessarily operate in hubs in Nairobi or in Luanda or in Lagos. They'll be, you know, out of these main hubs in more, you know, diverse regions where often they're not able to get there by aeroplane, or a lot of the flights that they can take are potentially not the safest airlines.
All right.
So
yeah.
I think it's not just about developing necessarily the hubs, but beyond the hubs as well.
All right, looking beyond the hubs as well. Yeah, here, let me just put that question to you as well, because you talked earlier about the difficulty in connecting the various tourism destinations within the continent. Which ones are easier to get to for you? Which ones prove completely difficult?
Well, mainly going to South Africa and Nairobi and North Africa is mainly the easiest countries to cooperate and communicate together, but stretching out to the east and west was a bit harder to coordinate for travelers. And I'd like to add that maybe the flights are very expensive for a very mere reason, is that's one of the very few ways to travel around countries in Africa, because if roads are covering most of the countries and connecting the countries, then we have an alternative in which airlines would have to compete with. Now they don't need to compete with nor low-cost airlines or roads. So whatever prices they put, people are going to have to travel, which does not push travel. It only pushes travelers who only need to travel for other purposes. But if we connect land and we connect with low-cost airlines, travelers who come from far away will duplicate their destinations once they land on the African continent. They wouldn't just visit one country, they would continue on visiting more.
All right, Mr. Kuchi, though we've been talking about low-cost airlines now in Africa for a while, but that hasn't really taken off as yet. What's hampering that, though?
Yeah, Beatrice, before I answer that, can I just say something briefly on the benefits of liberalization, as you asked Monique earlier? Yeah, just to say that last year, IATA commissioned a study in Africa covering 12 countries, 3 in each of the 4 sub-regions, just to establish if these 12 countries were to open up their markets to each other, what would be the benefits? What we discovered was that an increase, annual increase in GDP would be $1.3 billion across these 12 countries. Currently, about 5 million people who are unable to travel by air will be able to travel by air because there will be increased competition and fares will come down. Thirdly, we also discovered that on an annual basis, 155,000 jobs will be created, in addition to efficiency levels rising. Instead of people wasting times at airports, they will be able to go and come as they desire. So this study, we have presented it to many of the African governments in the countries where the study was conducted, just to tell them that we are constraining the growth of Africa by not actually liberalizing our air transport markets. Now, on the subject of low-cost carriers, the difficulty for low-cost carrier is that the typical low-cost carrier model operates in a high-volume, low-cost market. So the number of passengers are there, and then the cost of service providers at the various airports are lower. Then they can afford to charge lower fares. In Africa, as I indicated earlier on, the cost of operations are very high. Secondly, the passenger numbers are just not adequate for low-cost carriers between most of our African cities. That is why you would see the low-cost carriers that currently are operating are largely in the Southern African market and North Africa. Within the main African continent, there are hardly very successful African carriers. FastJet is trying to come on board there, but it has been struggling since its launch, having been making losses all these years. So the operating cost is the main concern for low-cost carriers challenge, as well as the lack of passenger numbers.
All right, Monique, in Johannesburg, I'll give you the final word on this one. How would you like this liberalization issue to go forward? How would you want to see Africa's skies working for the better of your industry?
Well, I think really just to try and increase, you know, the partnership between different countries and different governments, and get everybody understanding the importance of what open skies would mean for the continent, and just having everyone on the same page, encouraging a broader thinking. You know, instead of just thinking about my one little airline and trying to have make as much money as I can, which we know they don't anyway, but having a broader thought process about opening the continent up to bring more business in for everyone, so that everyone can benefit.
All right, Monique Schwartz joining us there from Johannesburg, Raphael Kuchi in Nairobi, and Yehia El Dicken joining us from Cairo. To you all, thank you very much for being on the program. And that's all we have time for this week on Talk Africa. Do join us again next week. Goodbye.